Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a job that no one dreams of having, but someone always has to do. A job soaked in silence, in sweat, and in the strange routines of justice. Tonight, we become the executioner, not the man in the black hood of myth, not the villain in the corner of old paintings. No, we become the real thing, the one who sharpens the blade, ties the rope, and shows up early because someone has to. Before we begin, take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy calm stories that wander through the darker corners of the past. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. That always makes the world feel just a little smaller. Now, lower the lights. Maybe find a quiet spot and settle in. Because tonight, we're not running from the past. We're stepping into its shoes. Let's get something out of the way. No child ever sat by a hearth fire and said, "I want to be the hangman when I grow up." Becoming a torturer or executioner wasn't a dream. It wasn't even a plan. It was what happened when all other paths were shut. You didn't apply. You didn't get invited. You were told. Sometimes because your father was one. Sometimes because you had strong arms and weak connections. Sometimes because no one else in town wanted to carry that weight. They didn't pick you because you were cruel. They picked you because you could do it without flinching. That was the main qualification. You didn't cry when someone screamed. You didn't drop the axe when it got sticky. You showed up, kept your mouth shut, and did the work no one else wanted to speak about. It wasn't glory. It was necessity. Towns needed bakers, blacksmiths, and butchers, and once in a while they needed someone who could break a man without breaking the law. Now, don't imagine a big black hood and a scary voice. That's theater. That's how people explain away fear. In truth, most torturers looked like anyone else, wore the same rough tunic, walked the same muddy streets. You didn't stand out. You couldn't afford to. If people noticed you too much, they remembered your face. And if they remembered your face, they remembered what you did. And no one wanted to invite that man to supper. I got the job because I had hands that didn't shake. That's what they told me. It wasn't a compliment, it was a sentence. One day, I was a guard who kept order in the market. The next, I was handed a set of iron tools and told I'd be needed in the lower room. No instructions, no ceremony, just a nod from the sheriff, and a door that closed behind me louder than it should have. The room smelled like old metal and wet stone. There was a table, a drain, and a bucket. That was it. Nothing clever, no secret mechanisms, just gravity, pressure, and pain. Someone had scratched names into the wood. I didn't recognize them. I didn't ask. The man tied to the chair that first day didn't scream. He just shook, mouth open, eyes already gone somewhere else. That's when I learned something important. Torture isn't about pain. It's about time. You don't start by breaking bones. You start by watching, waiting, letting the fear settle in like mold. Some people confessed before the first touch, some after hours, some never. But the fear, the silence between each word, that did more damage than any blade. We didn't call it torture. We called it questioning. That made it easier to sleep at night. He's being questioned. She's being held. That way, you could walk out of the chamber and tell yourself you were just following the law, not enjoying it, not inventing it, just applying it, like a coat of lime on a corpse before burial. And the law, well, it was flexible. A merchant accused of theft might be spared if he had friends. A beggar accused of blasphemy, no such luck. I kept a list in my head of the ones I couldn't forget. A boy who stole a loaf of bread and died with his hands crushed. A woman who screamed one name over and over, not because it meant anything, but because she thought saying something, anything, might make the pain stop. There were no witnesses in the room, just me, the prisoner, and the sound of rope tightening around wrists. That was the soundtrack of my early years. Rope creaking, breath catching, and sometimes silence. The kind that crawled under your skin and stayed there. At night I didn't drink much. I couldn't afford to. Sleep came slow, and when it came, it brought faces. Not angry ones, just tired, worn, hollow. They didn't curse me. They just stared, like they wanted me to remember. And I did. Every time. The townsfolk knew, of course, even if they pretended they didn't. They avoided my eyes in the square. They left my bread a little further down the table. Children were told not to speak to me. Wives crossed themselves when I passed. No one said anything directly, but I heard the whispers. That's him. Don't look. He does the work. And yes, I did, because someone had to, because in a world that believed in order, in confession, in punishment, someone had to hold the key. Someone had to make sure the king's justice had teeth. And if it was me, well, then it was me, because the morning still came. The rope still needed tying, and the list, it kept growing. The chamber where I worked wasn't marked. There was no sign above the arch, no guards posted beside the door, no scent of incense like near the chapel or sound of hammers like in the smithy. Just a low entrance, half buried into the foundation stones of the eastern courtyard, behind the old stable that no one used any more, and beside a wall where even the ivy refused to grow. To reach it, I passed through a crooked gate and stepped down 6 uneven stairs, each one worn smoother than the last, until I reached a door that groaned when it opened, but never stuck. The lock was simple, a wooden bolt, because those who entered didn't need to be kept out, and those who waited inside weren't meant to leave. The first thing you noticed wasn't the cold. That came later. What you noticed first was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind you get in the forest or in a church. It was the kind that pressed inward. A heavy, unnatural silence, like the stones themselves had learned to hold their breath. There were no windows. One torch bracket on the wall, usually lit when I arrived, and a single hole in the ceiling for smoke to drift out if the wind was kind. The walls had no markings, no scripture, no records of who'd passed through, just stone, slick with years of use and the kind of damp that never dried, no matter how many fires you burned. It was always damp, even in summer. The air sat heavy on the chest and made you speak slower, softer, if you spoke at all. There were tools, yes, though they were rarely the kind people imagine. No racks with blades gleaming in the dark, no cruel devices with spiked gears and blood grooves. Most of it was simpler. Wood, iron, rope, levers, a shallow basin, a few leather straps, a seat built too low to stand from once you were tied to it. There were pulleys in the ceiling and weights stored in a crate near the corner. A box with metal implements lined in faded cloth. None of it looked frightening. Not until you picked it up and realized how well it fit the hand, how much thought had gone into its balance, how easily it could be cleaned. I didn't invent these things. I inherited them, along with the room, the bench, and the bucket. My predecessor, whoever he was, left no instructions. Just a list of names and a ledger with lines too neat to have been written by a man who rushed. The ink was dry, the corners curled, but the handwriting had precision. You could see the discipline in it, the care. I didn't ask where he went. No one told me. One day I was a watchman with sore feet and a half-mended boot. The next, I was standing in the chamber, holding a pair of tongs that had once held something other than iron. They didn't train me. You don't get trained for this. You get told. That man there won't talk. Make him. That woman swears by saints and silence. Loosen her tongue. You learn the rest as you go. You learn how long someone can be left in the dark before they beg for light. You learn how many turns of the rope it takes before shoulders give way. You learn where pain hides and how to find it without asking twice. But most of all, you learn that time is the sharpest blade in the room. Wounds fade, bruises bloom and die. But time, that stays. Some prisoners confessed before I ever touched them. They arrived trembling, whispering names, deals, apologies to gods who weren't listening. Others fought with silence, not rage, not curses, just silence, a quiet refusal to break. Those were the hardest, not because they were stronger, but because they made you ask yourself who really deserved to be in that chair. A few cried out before I even began. They begged for forgiveness from men who would never hear them, from mothers, from children, from a life they no longer belonged to. And I listened, not because I cared, but because in that room words were currency and silence was treason. The tools didn't scare me, the screams didn't stay. What stayed were the eyes, the way people looked at me when they realized I wasn't a monster, just a man with a job, a face, a limp from an old wound, and hands that moved without shaking. That's when they broke, truly. Not when the pain came, but when the illusion ended. When they saw that the wall between torturer and victim wasn't as wide as they thought. I kept notes, not because I had to, no one checked, but I did. On scraps of paper hidden beneath a false board in my floor, I never wrote names, just symbols. A circle for the man who sang hymns while I worked, a triangle for the woman who never blinked, a crooked X for the one who laughed after every question. I don't know why I wrote them down, maybe to remember, maybe so I wouldn't forget that they were people, that I was too. At night, the room stayed with me, not as nightmares. I didn't dream much anymore, but in the way my fingers twitched at the sound of creaking rope, or how I always looked behind me when I walked through town, even though no one followed. People didn't speak to me much. They nodded. They paid. They made sure their disputes never reached my door. And in a strange way, that was peace. Because being the one who asks the final questions doesn't make you powerful. It makes you useful. And in our world, usefulness was survival. There comes a day in every torturer's path when the work no longer stays hidden beneath stone and shadow, when the chamber is left behind and the sky becomes witness, and you step into the square not as a man with a name, but as a function, a role, a grim necessity wrapped in cloth too dark for the hour. Mine came on a market day when the air was thick with the smell of boiled onions and ash, and the carts had only just started to arrive. It was early, too early for noise, and yet the square was already full. People love bread, but they love blood more. I was told the sentence the night before. A man caught robbing the bishop's cart, had struck a guard with a brick, and fled through the cloisters. He was cornered beneath the grain store, dragged out, beaten badly, and pronounced guilty before the bruises even bloomed. They said he'd stolen flour, but the real crime was hitting someone with a uniform. That turned him from a thief into a warning, and warnings were given in the open. They didn't ask if I was ready. They told me. A cart would arrive at dawn. The platform had already been built. It was always ready, just in case. The wood was dry. The blade had been checked. The rope hung on its nail beside the chapel's back door, where even the priest pretended not to notice. I spent the night sitting by the hearth, not drinking, not thinking, just staring into the fire as the tools were laid out beside me, one by one, not in order of use, but in order of consequence. First came the cord, then the cloth, then the axe. There was no cloak, no mask. That's for stories. I wore my work coat, stained at the edges, sleeves worn smooth. I was given gloves once, but they made the grip worse, so I left them behind. My hands were enough. When the bell rang and the crowd gathered, I didn't walk fast. There's a kind of rhythm to this work. Too quick, and you seem nervous. Too slow, and they think you enjoy it. There's a pace to the walk, heavy, steady, measured like a prayer, and I walked with it. The platform was square, 4 steps high, built from pine and patched oak, hammered together by men who never asked why. It creaked when I stepped on it, not from age, but from anticipation. There was a table with the instruments, a bucket of water, and a cloth already folded, as if someone believed cleanliness still had a place here. The prisoner was brought out moments later. He was young. That was the first thing I noticed. Not a man in his 60s with crimes behind him like dust, but a boy, maybe 20. His face was swollen, his nose crooked, his hands tied with a rope that cut too deep into his skin. They asked if he had last words. He said nothing, not out of defiance, just nothing left to say. I watched his eyes, not for hatred, not for peace, just distance. The kind of distance that meant he had already left the world a little. That part of him had already gone somewhere quiet, somewhere without steps or crowds or bells. And I wondered if he'd been there before, if this wasn't the first time he'd closed his eyes and imagined somewhere else. I didn't speak. I never did. That wasn't my role. The priest muttered something beside him. The sheriff gave a nod, and I did what was expected. The boy knelt, slow, as if his body had to remember how. I adjusted the rope so it didn't pull too far left. That matters more than you'd think. A crooked drop means noise, mess, mistakes. You want silence, finality, something that ends clean, not with panic. But this wasn't a hanging. This was the axe. And axes are not kind. I placed his head where it needed to be, not forcefully, just firmly. There's a pressure you learn, enough to guide, not enough to bruise. The cloth was damp, which helped. You don't want blood to spray too far. The bucket was near my feet. The blade rested on the wooden beam, angled just so. Not because it looks better, because it's quicker. The moment came, not with a shout, not with a signal, but with a breath. I counted them. I always did. 3 inches, 2 out. Then the hands tighten, the knees bend, and the swing comes not from the arms, but from the shoulders, the hips, the whole body. You learn to follow through, not to hesitate. Hesitation doesn't just ruin the act, it prolongs it. The sound is what stays, not the crowd, not the cry, though there wasn't one that day, but the sound of blade on flesh, on bone, on wood. It's not sharp. It's not crisp like in stories. It's a dull, heavy noise, like meat hitting stone, and it echoes, not loudly, but deeply. You hear it in your teeth. The head rolled once, just once. The cloth caught most of it. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back. Others leaned forward. A few cheered. They always do. Someone always does. It's not about justice. It's about seeing something final, something absolute. And I gave them that. Clean, quick, final. I lifted the blade again, not to strike, but to clean. You must always clean. Blood rusts faster than rain. The axe was wiped, the cloth rinsed, the platform left with nothing but footprints. The boy was taken away, not buried, not honored, just gone. And I walked home as I always did, slow, measured, alone. There's a moment that comes after every execution, after the platform is cleared and the crowd dissolves into murmurs, after the guards finish their duties and the last nail of the coffin is driven into cheap wood by hands that do not ask for names, a moment when I find myself standing in the center of the empty square long after the sun has shifted, and I stare down at my own shadow, stretched across the boards where a life just ended, and I ask myself if I still feel anything at all. And most days I don't, or I tell myself I don't, because feelings are for those who can afford them, and I've long since spent mine on things that didn't deserve them. The axe I carry is not ornamental. It was forged for work, not ceremony. The edge is not silvered, not decorated, not blessed. It is steel and weight, and a handle polished smooth by years of calloused palms. I've used the same one since my third execution. The first two were done with another man's blade, borrowed, heavy in the wrong way, as if it belonged to someone who still lingered in the handle, whispering through the grip. But this one fits. Balanced just enough to let the shoulder lead, heavy enough that the neck doesn't resist. You learn its rhythm, you learn its hunger, because make no mistake, the axe remembers. Not in a mystical way, not in the way stories pretend, but in the honest way wood warps and steel wears. It remembers pressure, it remembers resistance, and it remembers hesitation. I've kept the edge sharp with oil and stone, never rushing it, never letting others touch it. There's a kind of peace in maintenance, a quiet hour in the morning where everything else fades, and it's just me, the grindstone, and the slow circular motion of preparation. Some men pray before a job. I sharpen. That is my devotion. That is my offering. Because a dull blade is cruelty, and cruelty, despite what they say, is never the goal. The goal is finality, quickness, precision. You do not punish with pain. You punish with certainty. I remember the first time the blade didn't go through. It was cold that morning, colder than usual for that time of year, and the man brought to me was large, thick-necked, his skin covered in soot and scars from the foundry where he worked before they caught him stealing iron bars for some imagined rebellion. I swung, clean, straight, with full intent, but the flesh resisted. The sound was wrong. The neck did not break. The crowd gasped, and I saw in their eyes the thing they never wanted to see, that I was human, that I could err, that I was not a creature of myth, but a man with bones and breath and the possibility of failure. So I struck again, and the fourth time the head fell, and the stain it left followed me home like a dog I hadn't fed. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. I didn't speak to the boy who delivered my firewood, though he waited longer than usual at the door, perhaps wondering if he should ask what had happened in the square. But he didn't. They never do. I learned from that, not just about angles and posture, but about silence. How quickly it creeps in when you break the illusion. The people need to believe in efficiency, in control, in the myth that justice flows clean and quiet. They need to believe that I am a blade and nothing more. And so, I became one. The robe I wear on execution days is darker than my everyday tunic. Not black, not dramatic, just the deep brown of dried earth, stitched with care by a widow who owed a favor to the sheriff. It's heavy in the shoulders and frays near the elbows, but I keep it mended. You don't want to look too new. That makes you seem young, and youth has no place on the scaffold. The hat is optional. I wear it when the sun is strong, when the sweat might blind me. Not for effect, for function. Always for function. And when it's done, when the crowd is gone and the stain on the boards begins to dry and curl at the edges like autumn leaves, I carry the axe back home wrapped in cloth, never bare, never left out where hands might touch it without knowing. I lay it down beside the fire, not on display, just resting, like a tool after the harvest, like something that earned the stillness. Sometimes, in the quiet, I trace the grain of the wood with my thumb, feel the worn places where my fingers have shaped it, and I wonder how many more before the handle snaps, before the weight becomes too much, before even I am too dull to finish cleanly. But not today. Today, I sharpened it well. There are many faces I have forgotten, and I do not feel shame in that, because a man in my position cannot carry every detail, cannot catalog every cry, or remember the precise way every knee buckled before the moment of judgment. The mind builds walls where it must, and I have let it, brick by quiet brick, until the chambers of memory grew narrow and selective, allowing in only those that refuse to be locked away. And yet there are faces that persist, not because they were noble or wicked or strange, but because something in them lingered, something unspoken that passed between us in the instant before I raised my hand to do what I was paid to do. One such face belonged to a merchant, well-dressed, silver-haired, eyes that once knew profit and disappointment in equal measure. He was caught skimming weight from the grain barrels bound for the church, replacing good harvest with stones wrapped in linen, and claiming poor yield from the eastern fields. He wasn't the first to cheat, and he wouldn't have been punished so harshly had he not denied the charges so loudly, so repeatedly, even as evidence mounted like dust on the magistrate's desk. It was the audacity they could not abide, the public refusal to bow. So they made a display of him, and I was the means. When they brought him to the square, he did not curse, he did not weep. He smiled, not kindly, not mockingly, just smiled the way men do when they know that words have failed and silence is the only armor left. And when I positioned him, adjusted the block, steadied the cloth, he looked at me not as a man, not as a villain or deliverer, but simply as a reflection of the system he had danced with for too long. He looked, and in that look I saw no fear, only recognition. He knew. He had always known that this is how it ends for men who play too well and lose. After the stroke, I found myself pausing a beat longer than usual, not from doubt, but from an odd sort of grief, not for him, but for the illusion that men like him are immune, that wealth protects, that cleverness buys eternity. The crowd dispersed more quietly that day. Perhaps they saw it too. Perhaps the weight of his name on their tongues made them think of their own accounts, their own small deceptions. Or perhaps I imagined all of it. That happened sometimes. Another face, harder to explain, belonged to a woman from the outer village, small in stature, pale as parchment, brought in for reasons that were never fully explained to me. The writ said heresy, but the clerk who delivered her looked uncertain, and the priest who followed stayed silent throughout. She spoke no words, gave no struggle, merely folded her hands as though preparing for prayer, and looked at the ceiling with eyes that never once met mine. It was not contempt. It was something colder, detachment, as if she had never lived among us, as if the world we moved in was something she had already let go of. The moment the axe fell, I felt a weight in my chest that did not pass with the cleaning of the blade or the folding of the cloth. It followed me home. It stayed through supper. It lingered near the door while I tried to read. And when I finally slept, it came into my dreams, not with blood, not with screams, but with silence so complete it rang louder than anything I had heard in the chamber below the square. In the morning I found myself walking to the chapel, not to pray, but to sit, to wait, to listen. And though the priest said nothing, though no voice came from the altar, I felt the weight shift, just enough to breathe again. Faces like these do not fade. They shape the work. They remind you that the line between the guilty and the condemned is sometimes drawn in ink too light to read. They teach you caution, not in hand, but in heart. And so I began writing in a second ledger, one no one knew about, hidden beneath the floorboards, beside the older one I had long filled with symbols and impressions. In this new book I wrote longer entries, observations, emotions I could not speak aloud, not confessions. I am not a confessor, but records. Witness accounts, perhaps, not of their guilt, but of their humanity. It became a ritual. After every execution, after every questioning that ended with too much silence, I would return to my room, light the same stub of candle, open the worn cover, and write. A page, sometimes two, never names, but always truths, small ones. The way the wind shifted just before a scream, the way a mother looked at me when I walked past her door, the way the city grew quiet when it rained the morning after a hanging, and in doing so, I found that the work did not disappear. It settled, not as guilt, but as weight evenly distributed, like a pack one carries when there is no destination, only motion, always motion. They once asked me if I would take on an apprentice, a boy from the southern district, son of a weaver who died of frostbite the previous winter, clever with tools and quiet in nature, a rare combination in a city where most youths ran too fast and shouted their futures into alleys that offered nothing in return. The sheriff thought I might teach him. He said it as though passing me a bag of grain, something simple, something inevitable. But I said no, not because the boy lacked promise, not because he would not one day make a fine carpenter or clerk, or even, in time, a torturer if fate grew cruel. I said no, because I knew that once you open this door, it never truly closes again. No one becomes a torturer because they dreamed of it. It is not a calling. It is a silence that finds you when no other sound remains. I did not grow into this trade. I fell into it, slowly, through gaps in duty and moments when no one else stepped forward. The first time I was asked to help was not even during an official sentence. It was an interrogation gone poorly, where the city guard had left a man too long without food and too short on air, and they needed someone who could revive him just enough to ask again. They needed hands that didn't tremble. Mine didn't. Not that day. I had only meant to assist, to hold the basin, to pour the water, to clean the floor. But when the overseer stepped out and didn't return, and the man on the bench groaned something that might have been a confession or might have been a prayer, I stayed. I pressed the cloth again, I waited, I listened, and when the man finally spoke clearly, when the truth came out, not clean, but real, they looked at me as if I had conjured it from the walls themselves. And from that moment, I was no longer just a guard. I had become the tool that delivered results. No one celebrates when you find your purpose in pain. There is no feast, no gift, no golden seal from the magistrate's hand. Just more tasks, more names, more doors opening into darker rooms. I received no training. I watched. I waited. I asked nothing. And slowly I understood. That pain is not always about the flesh. That pressure comes in many forms. That silence, when prolonged, is its own kind of blade. So when they offered me the boy, I saw not a student, but a mirror, a reflection of myself before the work had carved away the softness, before the chamber had taught me how to read the shift of a shoulder, the twitch of a jaw, the breath caught just before the scream. I saw him bending metal into shapes, twisting thread through canvas, making something with his hands instead of unmaking someone with them. And I thought, why trade that for this? The sheriff didn't argue. He shrugged, said it was my choice. But I saw the relief in his eyes. He hadn't wanted to send the boy. He just hadn't known what else to do with someone that quiet. Silence unnerves people when it comes from the young. They expect noise, defiance, laughter, foolishness, not calm, not stillness. And so they try to push them into corners where silence is needed. But not all silence is the same. Mine was shaped by necessity. His was shaped by gentleness. That evening I left the chamber door unlocked, just for a moment, just long enough to stand in the threshold and look inward. The room was as it always was, still, damp, waiting, and I imagined what it might have looked like to the boy. A stone box, tools on a wall, shadows too deep for comfort, a bench that no longer smelled of wood. And I knew with absolute certainty that had I entered this place as a child, had someone placed my hand upon a handle and told me to listen for pain, I might have broken. We all arrive at our destinies eventually, but some doors, if kept closed just long enough, will be forgotten, not erased, just unfound. I never saw the boy again. Perhaps he learned a trade. Perhaps he left the city. Perhaps he became a man who never asked too many questions and lived long enough to forget the day he was almost chosen. And I'm glad for that, because once you take your first step into the room, it marks you. Even if you run, even if you leave, part of you remains seated on that bench, in that cold, airless place where truth is dragged out of the body, not with reason, but with repetition. Some men leave behind swords, others books, others names on stone. I will leave no heir, no student, no legacy, only records. There is a rhythm to the work that most never see, a cadence not found in the act itself, but in what comes after, when the cries have faded and the door has closed, and all that remains is the task of returning the room to silence. A silence not of absence but of arrangement, where every tool is cleaned, every stain addressed, every surface wiped down, not with urgency, but with care, because the chamber must never forget its purpose, and yet it must never cling to its past. I have come to prefer the cleaning. It is honest work, without judgment, without the weight of decision. It asks only diligence. The floor is stone, uneven in places, worn smooth in others by years of pacing, shifting, kneeling. The stains do not come out easily. Some never do, but I scrub them anyway, each morning, each evening, each time the work is done. I use hot water when I can, mixed with herbs that keep the air from turning sour. Herbs I buy from an old woman near the edge of the market who does not ask what they're for. She thinks I am a butcher. Perhaps she is right. The walls are simpler, more forgiving. They only need wiping. I use a cloth I keep separate from the others, not because it's sacred, but because some jobs require their own instruments. I move slowly, from corner to corner, tracing the same lines I've traced for years, following shadows that no longer shift when the lantern flickers. It is during these moments, when the room is quiet and my hands are busy, that I allow my mind to speak. Not loudly, just enough to sort what has passed. The tools must be cleaned last, not for superstition, but for practicality. You do not wash the knife before the basin. You do not polish the metal before the blood is dried. I place them on a cloth beside the bench, one by one, never stacked, never mixed. Each has its place. The clamps, the cords, the pins, the block. The hammer, though rarely used, still earns its inspection. And the iron, still warm from the brazier, must be cooled slowly, not quenched. You do not temper truth by force. You guide it. I have named none of them. That is a line I have not crossed. They are tools, not companions. I do not speak to them. I do not imagine personalities in their edges or tempers in their wear. I sharpen them when needed. I oil them when the air is dry. I replace them when rust appears beyond saving. And when one breaks, I bury it in the courtyard behind the barracks, not for honor, but because even metal deserves an end that is not the trash heap. The bench is wooden, broad, with a dip in the middle where weight has worn it down. It was made by a carpenter who did not know what it would be used for, or so they say. I doubt that. The shape is too exact, the grooves too purposeful. Still, I treat it with respect. I wash it, sand it when needed, keep the strap supple with oil. There is no dignity in the work if the instruments are left to rot. Once a month, I replace the straw beneath the floorboards. It absorbs what cloth does not. It keeps the smell from rising. I burn the old straw outside the city, in a pit dug long ago by those who knew they'd need it. No one asks why I pass through the gate with sacks. They assume, as people do, and I let them. The lanterns are trimmed at dusk, each wick cut to the same length, each glass polished until the light no longer flickers across the chains above. Light matters. Too much, and you see what you shouldn't. Too little, and you imagine what's not there. I've found a balance. 3 lanterns, one near the door, one near the bench, one above the wall rack. It creates an even glow, soft enough not to blind, strong enough to reveal. Sometimes, late at night, I return to the chamber not to work, but to sit. I bring no tools, no tasks, just myself and the silence. I light the middle lantern, leave the others dark, and sit on the edge of the bench, hands folded, eyes closed. I do not meditate. I do not dream. I listen, not to voices or echoes, but to the memory of movement. The room remembers posture. The floor remembers weight. And in that stillness, I remember who I am beneath the work. Not a monster, not a hero, not a priest of pain, just a man who cleans. There is a pattern to the way people plead, a structure I've come to recognize over the years, not because I sought it out, but because repetition leaves nothing hidden for long. And when one hears the same tones, the same syllables, the same desperate stringing together of names and phrases and bargains, the ear learns to anticipate the curve of the voice before it arrives. Most begin with denial, even when the truth is a ghost already seated beside them, even when the ropes tighten and the silence of the room makes every breath feel like an admission. They say, "I didn't do it." They say, "You've got the wrong man." They look to the corners of the room as though a rescuer might emerge, as though some forgotten official might barge in with a scroll and a gasp and call it all off. But that never happens. Not here. Then comes the offering: gold, land, services, names. They promise anything. They speak of cousins in distant towns, of deeds that can be rewritten, of cellars that hide things no one has seen. They lower their voices, lean forward if the chains allow, and speak as if we are partners in some bargain, as if I might be convinced to turn the key and forget the purpose of the room. They do not understand. I do not seek advantage. I do not make deals. I am not the hand of mercy or the gate of opportunity. I am the blade of certainty, and once the wheel turns, it does not spin back. And then they cry, some loudly, some quietly, some sob as though mourning their own lives while still living them. Others weep like children, soft and confused. The crying changes things. It slows the process, not because it works, but because it reminds me that this is not a story. This is not a page to be turned. This is a person with breath and memory, collapsing beneath the weight of consequences they never truly believed would arrive. But what comes after the crying? That is where the truth lives. When the sobs fade and the body sags and the voice grows raw and brittle, when there are no more promises to give and no one left to beg to, that is when they speak clearly. Sometimes it is a confession. Sometimes it is a question. Sometimes it is silence, more honest than any word. I do not rush them. I wait. I let the room hold them. And in that stillness, they reveal what matters. There was a man once, older than most, who passed through the chamber, eyes clouded with age, back hunched from years in the mines. He had stolen. That was not disputed. He admitted it before I asked. But they wanted more. They wanted names, roots, the whole web, and so they sent him to me. He did not plead. He did not deny. He looked at me and said, "Ask what you need." And I did, slowly, carefully, and he answered, not with bravado, not with resistance, but with precision, like a man laying bricks he knew would outlive him. When it was done, I asked him why he spoke so plainly. He said, "Because it's easier than the screaming." And then he smiled, not out of joy, but out of fatigue, as if he had already done all his crying in other years, in other rooms, far from here. I remember him more clearly than most, not because of what he said, but because of how little he tried to change his ending. Not everyone pleads. Some arrive already broken, already quiet. Those are the ones I watch most carefully, because quiet does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means waiting for a mistake, for a slip, for a chance. And if you're not vigilant, the silence will trick you. But I have learned, I do not speak unless spoken to. I do not ask questions beyond what is written. I follow the ledger. I keep the rhythm, because the chamber is not a place for improvisation. It is a ritual. It is structure. And within that structure, there is no room for pity. I do not hate them for begging. I do not despise them for the words they hurl, for the bargains they attempt, for the lies they throw like dust in the hope it might blind me. They are doing what they must. Survival wears many faces, and fear, when it grows large enough, forgets how to whisper. It only knows how to shout. But I cannot let their shouting shift my hands. I cannot let their tears dull the edge. If I do, the work becomes something else. It becomes cruelty, and cruelty is not the goal, only completion. Most look away. It is not shame, it is instinct. The eyes search for escape even when the body cannot follow. They turn toward the floor, the wall, the ceiling, anywhere but the face that stands between them and the moment they've spent days pretending would never come. Some keep their heads down the entire time, as though the stone beneath their feet might open and swallow them, as though if they just do not look up, none of it will become real. But there are a few who meet your gaze, and those are the ones that stay with you. Not because they are braver, not because they are innocent or guilty in a way more profound than the rest. They stay with you because the human face, when stripped of pretense, becomes something closer to a mirror than a mask. It reflects things you do not wish to see: doubt, weariness, memory. In those eyes you sometimes see yourself, not as you are, not in form, but in emotion, in the flicker of confusion and the faint tremble of recognition. It is in those moments that the chamber feels most alive. There was a girl once, hardly past childhood, taken for reasons I never understood fully. The writ said treason, but the town knew better. She had been born in the wrong house, said the wrong thing to the wrong man, and had refused to apologize. Sometimes that is enough. She was quiet when they brought her in, not afraid, just tired, as though she had skipped all the steps that come before fear and landed directly in the middle of resignation. I placed the cloth across the bench. I adjusted the cords. She watched me without blinking. When I turned, she said one word: "Why?" I did not answer. I never do. But the way she said it, it wasn't accusation. It wasn't even curiosity. It was observation, as though she already knew there was no answer and yet needed to speak the word aloud anyway, to hang it in the air between us like an old coat left on a nail. She did not scream. She did not bargain. She sat. She endured. And when it was over, they took her away, and I stood in the doorway for longer than usual, listening to the echo of her breath still clinging to the stones. I have been looked at with hatred. That does not move me. Hatred is predictable. It speaks in the same tones, uses the same words. I have been looked at with pity too, and that is worse, because pity assumes you have fallen, that you were once somewhere higher, somewhere purer, and have since been dragged into something beneath your worth. But I was not dragged. I walked slowly, repeatedly, and every step I took into this work was a step I did not undo. So pity does not wound me. It only misjudges me. But it is the calm eyes, the ones that do not hate, do not pity, do not fear, that make the work heavier, because in them there is a kind of knowing, a recognition that goes beyond circumstance. I saw such eyes in a scholar once, thin and pale, mouth always on the edge of laughter, though he never laughed. He was brought in for blasphemy, though I doubt he believed in anything at all. He looked at me as though he had read about me in a book long before he met me, as though I were part of some system he had always known would catch him. He asked if I wanted to know his theory on the soul. I said nothing. He told it to me anyway, between pauses in the work. He said he believed the soul is like wax, and that every moment of pain pressed a seal into it, leaving marks no fire could melt. I remember his voice more than his face, calm, flat, almost kind. He thanked me at the end, not sarcastically, genuinely. And I think, in that moment, he believed we had shared something meaningful. But I do not fool myself with the idea of connection. This is not confession. This is not therapy. This is not healing. It is a function, a system, a chain of steps that lead from accusation to conclusion. And I am the part of the chain that holds, not judges, not releases, just holds. Still, I remember those who looked me in the eye, not every detail, not every word, but the weight of their gaze, the pressure it left in the space between the lantern and the bench, and sometimes when I pass the square and the wind moves just right, I feel it again, the quiet stare of someone who knew what was coming and refused to blink. There is a smell that never fully leaves the chamber, no matter how often I scrub, no matter how many herbs I scatter in corners, or how long I let the air flow through the open grates when the sky allows it. It is not the smell of blood alone. Blood is sharp, immediate, almost metallic, like biting your tongue during a lie. No, what lingers is something slower, deeper, a mix of old iron and old breath, of wood rubbed smooth by too many bodies and damp stone soaked in too many secrets. It is a smell that lives in my clothes, in the fibers of my sleeves, in the seams of my boots, and though others may not notice it, I do, always. Sometimes when I walk through the market, I pass near a baker's stall and catch the scent of bread just as it leaves the oven, soft and warm, and so far removed from anything I know that it stings. Not because I am hungry, but because I remember a time, faint and distant, when I smelled only bread and smoke and wet leaves in autumn, before the chamber shaped my senses into something narrower. Now the scent of iron follows me like a shadow. I've tried perfumes once or twice. They made it worse, like painting overwrought. The nose knows. I clean myself with purpose, not for pride, not for vanity, but because the work demands it. When I leave the chamber, I do not bring its marks with me into the world. I keep my face shaven, my nails trimmed, my boots polished. There are those who think torturers must look a certain way, ragged, haunted, cloaked in grime and horror. But that is theater, not truth. Cleanliness is control, and control is everything. Still, no matter what I do, the scent remains, in my gloves, in my hair. I smell it most when I lie down at night, when the heat from the bed pulls it upward like smoke from a dying flame. I have come to associate it with sleep, not rest, just sleep, the kind where dreams press against the eyes but never enter, the kind where the body stills but the mind continues to walk the same stone corridors over and over again. I once asked a physician if scent can embed itself in the blood. He said no. He said it is memory that tricks the senses, that the mind holds smells longer than the body. I nodded, but I did not believe him. The mind does hold memory, yes, but the body wears it like armor, thin, invisible armor that seeps through the skin until even silence smells of iron. There are days I avoid speaking to others because I worry they will smell it too. Not the scent itself, perhaps, but the presence of something not right. The same way animals tense before storms or children go quiet when grief enters a room. The work does not stay behind the chamber door. It follows, not in the form of noise or stain, but as scent and posture and stillness. And people notice, even if they do not say so. Once a child approached me in the square. He held a toy carved from wood, roughly shaped like a soldier. He asked if I was the man who makes people tell the truth. His mother pulled him away quickly, whispered something I could not hear. But the boy looked back at me and sniffed the air. He wrinkled his nose, not in disgust, but in confusion. And in that small gesture I saw understanding begin, a seed planted, not of fear, but of awareness. He did not cry. He did not run. He simply looked. It is the same look I have seen in dogs that pass me in the alleys. They do not bark. They do not approach. They tilt their heads and sniff, then move on, as if deciding I am neither danger nor safety, just a scent too dense to name. I sometimes wonder if I stopped the work, if I sealed the chamber forever and burned every tool and buried the keys deep enough, whether the smell would fade, whether, with time, the air around me would clear, and I could once again walk through a field or lean into the wind without carrying the taste of rust on my tongue. But I suspect not. Some things, once absorbed, do not release. They stay in the fibers, in the flesh, in the breath you do not notice until it is all that remains. There is a book I keep, though no one ever asked me to. It is not the official register. That lies with the court, bound in thick hide and chained to the magistrate's office, guarded like a holy relic, inked by clerks who have never seen the inside of the chamber. My book is smaller, quieter, tucked beneath a loose board near the hearth in my quarters. The cover is worn, the pages rough at the edges, smudged in places from damp fingertips and candle wax. I do not write names. I do not write dates. I write moments. It began as a way to remember, not what happened, but how it felt. The weight of a voice, the shape of a sentence spoken too slowly, the sound of rope tightening just before it settles into stillness. I thought, perhaps, that if I wrote it down, it would leave me, but it did not. It only multiplied, like shadows in a room with too many lanterns. Still, I write. Each entry is brief, a few lines, sometimes a word. Eyes like broken glass, asked about the rain, did not blink when I reached for the cloth. These are not confessions. These are not verdicts. They are fragments, pieces of people who passed through the chamber but left something behind, something that could not be filed or stored or forgotten. The ledger is not for memory. It is for recognition, so that I do not pretend I am untouched. I have shown it to no one, not out of fear, but out of respect. The pages are not secrets. They are not accusations. They are moments too fragile for the official voice of justice. The court speaks in sentences. I speak in silence. The ledger speaks in between. Sometimes late at night, when the fire is low and the room smells of wax and ash, I open it and read, not from the beginning, but at random, a page from last winter, a note from years ago, a sentence I do not remember writing, and in those words I find pieces of myself scattered among the dust. I do not analyze them. I do not build meaning from them. I simply observe. There is one entry I return to more often than the rest. I do not know why. It reads, held his breath for 16 seconds before answering, looked at me like we shared a secret. I do not remember the man's name. I do not remember his crime. But I remember that pause, that shared stillness, as if for a brief moment he and I existed in the same shape, two halves of a locked door. The court would not understand the ledger. They would ask why I wrote these things, what purpose they serve, what legal value they hold. They would call it indulgence, sentiment, weakness. But the ledger is not for them. It is not for anyone. It is the space between the tools and the sentence, the part of the work that no one sees, the breath taken just before the cloth is lifted. If the day ever comes when I cannot write in it, when the words stop forming or the lines grow empty, I will know it is time to stop. Not because I will no longer be able to perform the tasks, but because the part of me that sees the difference between procedure and presence will have gone. And without that, the chamber becomes only a room, and I become only a machine. I do not fool myself into thinking the ledger redeems me. It is not a shield. It is not an apology. It is simply a record of presence, of having been there, of having seen and heard and felt in a way that leaves a mark deeper than any blade. Some men drink, some pray. I write. If they ever find it, long after I am gone, they will not understand. They will read the lines and think them riddles or madness, or the ramblings of a mind softened by solitude. But if someone reads closely enough, if they listen between the words, they might hear the shape of a life not chosen, but inhabited, a life held in place not by duty, but by the slow, deliberate rhythm of breath and ink. They might not forgive me, but they will know I did not forget. There are days when the chamber remains dark, the brazier is cold, the tools stay in the drawer, the cords are not disturbed, the bench sits untouched beneath the lanterns, and the air, for once, carries only the scent of stone and dust. These are the days no one comes, no writs are signed, no men are sent, no voices echo down the stairs. The hallway beyond the wooden door stays silent, and the world above forgets, briefly, that the chamber exists. I do not celebrate these days. I do not dread them either. They simply are. I rise at the same time. I dress in the same manner. I descend the steps and open the door with the same quiet ritual. I check the lanterns, the chains, the handles. I pass my hands along the bench, testing for cracks, for warping, for anything that suggests time has moved faster than I expected. And when I am done, I close the door and return upstairs, where I make tea and sit in the small chair by the window that overlooks the courtyard, watching the wind stir leaves into lazy spirals. Sometimes on these days, I clean the chamber anyway, not because it needs it, but because rhythm matters. The work is not only what happens when the door closes behind the accused. The work is in the preparation, the care, the structure. To maintain the chamber is to remember what it is for, and forgetting, even for a single day, invites something dangerous, a sense of distance, a sense that the room exists separately from the man who tends it. But that is not true. I am part of it, and it is part of me. I write more on the quiet days. The ledger sees longer entries, fuller thoughts, stray memories that surface in the stillness and demand to be recorded. I do not reflect. I do not analyze. I observe. How the light falls differently across the stone. How the silence holds a kind of weight when it is not broken by voices or footsteps. How the mind drifts toward other rooms, other cities, other lifetimes that might have been. I do not chase these thoughts. I let them arrive and leave as they please. There is a strange peace in the absence of orders, not relief, not freedom, just the hush of paused machinery. The wheels still exist, the gears still turn, but slower, softer, as if the system takes a breath of its own before exhaling back into duty. I have never asked what causes these breaks, whether justice sleeps or guilt delays or power shifts in ways I am not meant to see. It does not matter. The door remains, and as long as it stands, the silence will never be permanent. I once went 3 days without a summons. It was winter. The streets were iced. The couriers could not ride. The courts were closed. And for those days, the city moved without judgment. I walked along the edge of the river. I watched frost gather on railings and listened to the creak of branches snapping under snow. I bought a loaf of bread from a woman who did not know my name and sat beneath the awning of a closed smithy, eating it slowly as the sky turned from gray to black. I remember the way the cold bit through my gloves. I remember the silence of footsteps that did not belong to anyone but me. But even then, the chamber was with me, in the shape of my hands, in the way I scanned each alley, in the posture of my shoulders as I passed others in the fog. I do not remove the work. I wear it, not as pride, not as shame, but as skin. There are those who believe silence heals, that a day without noise, a day without struggle, allows the mind to soften, to stretch, to breathe. I do not know if that is true. For me, silence does not erase. It reveals. It clears the surface so that what lies beneath rises, and often what rises is not peace, but memory. And memory, unlike orders, does not obey the court. When the summons comes again, and it always does, I return to the chamber not as if I were waking from sleep, but as if I had simply been standing still, waiting for the wheel to turn once more. The tools do not move on their own, and yet there are days when I enter the chamber and feel as though something has shifted in my absence. The ropes lie coiled, as they always do. The clamps are stacked, oiled and ready, the hooks hung with care. But the air carries something different, not louder, not colder, just aware, as if the room itself has remembered something I have not. I do not believe in haunted walls. I believe in memory, and tools, like people, remember. Each tool has its own sound, its own voice, not in the way of words, but in tone, in rhythm. The way the chain clicks when lifted, the soft groan of a wheel turning under strain, the brief sharp note of metal brushing wood. I know them all. I do not need to look to know which one has shifted on the bench. The sounds guide my hands more than sight. In darkness, I would still know what to reach for, not because I was trained that way, but because repetition teaches what memory forgets. There is a misconception among those who speak of my craft in whispers and half-truths, that the tools are cruel, that their purpose is to cause suffering. But tools do not have intent, only hands do. A blade is not evil, a rope does not hate. Even the wheel, wide and splintered and forever stained, is nothing more than wood shaped to function. It does not rejoice. It does not regret. It simply responds to pressure. Like all things, I clean them each night, whether used or not. I polish the metal, check the joints, unwind and rewind the cords, not to make them beautiful. They are not meant to be beautiful, but to keep them from rust. Decay invites hesitation, and hesitation invites failure. A tool must be ready always, and readiness is not found in strength alone. It is found in care, in presence, in touch. There is one blade I favor more than the rest. It is not larger, not sharper, but it is balanced. The handle fits my palm as if carved from memory. It is the blade I reach for when the questioning grows long, when the voice across from me starts to blur into the stones, when the silence grows too thick to hold with words alone. I have replaced its edge many times, but the grip remains the same, worn smooth by use, stained dark by years. I do not name it, I am not foolish, but I know its weight better than I know my own breath. Some tools are no longer used. Methods fall out of favor. The court grows more delicate, more cautious. They speak of rights, of restraint, of appearances. And so certain things are retired, placed in drawers and left untouched. But I do not discard them. I keep them clean, wrapped, remembered. Not out of nostalgia, but because everything that was once needed may be needed again. Time does not move in straight lines. It circles. I once had an assistant years ago. He was young, eager, too loud. He asked questions, too many. He wanted to understand how each tool worked, not just mechanically, but emotionally. He spoke of purpose, of philosophy, of justice. I let him stay until he stopped asking, not because he understood, but because he realized there were no answers that would make the work easier to hold. He left one morning without a word. I never saw him again, but he left his gloves behind, folded neatly beside the wheel. I keep them still. They remind me that not all who enter are meant to remain. The chamber is not a museum, but it is not a slaughterhouse either. It is a place of process, of questions and pressure, and the tools, simple as they are, carry that weight with me. I do not speak to them. I do not give them character. But when I lift one from the drawer and feel its balance settle into my wrist, I know the work has begun again. And when I return it, cleaned and quiet, I place it with care, because the silence that follows a session is just as important as the noise that preceded it. Everyone remembers their first time, not just the act, but the space around it, the scent of the room, the shape of the light, the way your own hands look when placed against something that will not move unless you move it. My first time was not dramatic. There were no cries for mercy, no shouting from the corridor, no last-minute stays. It was a quiet afternoon. The rain had made the streets soft and the lanterns dull. The chamber felt smaller than usual. I remember thinking how little sound there was. The man had stolen something. Bread, I think, or a coin pouch. It was not the crime that brought him to me, but the fact that he refused to speak about it. He would not say where it went, who helped him, what he planned. Silence, to some, is more dangerous than action, and so he was brought below, placed on the bench, wrists bound, eyes wide but dry. I stood over him for a long time before moving, not because I was unsure, because I knew there would never be another first. I had practiced, of course, on straw, on cloth, on carved shapes of wood, meant to mimic joints and flesh. But no amount of practice changes the moment when a voice breaks for the first time, when the sound of breath changes into something else entirely. I did not flinch. I did not rush. I followed the steps I had memorized. Cloth, knot, question, wait, repeat. There was a rhythm to it even then, and he broke, not in words, but in posture. His spine curled inward, his gaze lowered. His fingers, bound though they were, twitched like birds caught in nets. He spoke. He gave names. I wrote them down in a hand steadier than I expected. I undid the cords. I offered water. He drank. Then he looked at me and said, "Thank you." I still do not know why. Gratitude, relief, or something else. The court processed him the next morning. I never saw him again. I returned to the chamber that evening and stood by the bench. The tools had been cleaned, the lantern dimmed. The air was still thick with the scent of breath and fear. I closed my eyes and listened. I thought I might feel guilt or triumph. I felt neither. I felt something quieter, a kind of confirmation, as though something in me had been waiting for that exact moment to become solid. That night I dreamed of staircases, endless steps turning back on themselves, the same lamp swinging overhead, the same silence pressing in. I woke before reaching the top. I have never reached the top in any of the dreams, always climbing, always turning, but never arriving. People often ask, though rarely aloud, how one becomes a torturer, as if there is a school, a guild, a summons that arrives in the dead of night. But it is not like that. It begins small, an assistant to a scribe, a helper in a court, someone who stays late and listens, someone who learns how to look without speaking. And then one day, someone hands you a task no one else wants, a difficult question, a closed door, and you say yes, not out of cruelty, not out of ambition, but because saying yes is easier than wondering who will say it if you do not. I did not plan to become what I am. I followed the shape of each day until the days no longer had shape without the work. And the chamber, which once seemed like a space apart, became the place where my steps most naturally fell. Sometimes I revisit that first entry in the ledger. It is short, 6 words. Eyes still, voice cracked, he wept. I do not recall the weeping, but the entry insists, and so I accept it, not because it matters to the court, but because it matters to me. The first sound, the first pause, the first time the bench held more than wood. I never spoke of that day, not then, not now, except here, in silence, in ink. Above the chamber, the city pretends. It wears its mask well. The stones are warm in summer, the markets loud with color and noise. The bells of the chapel call out to prayers spoken more from habit than belief. Children run through alleys with sticks for swords. Women lean from windows to shout across courtyards, and bakers dust their aprons with the rhythm of hands that do not wonder what lies beneath the cobbles. The city lives loudly, blindly, beautifully, but it knows I exist. It may not speak of me, it may not know my name, but the people know someone does what must be done, that somewhere beneath their shoes and carriages there is a room without sunlight, and in that room voices are changed. Truth is found, justice is sharpened, and they are grateful, quietly, from a distance, like one might be grateful for fire, so long as it stays on the torch and not on the thatch. I walk among them often, not to spy, not to remind, simply because it is where I am meant to walk. I buy my bread, I nod to the candlemaker, I feed a bird with the same crumbs each week near the fountain where the water no longer flows. They see me, they do not name me, but they know. Their eyes do not lie. There is a pause in the air when I pass, not of fear, but of recognition, as if the wind has shifted and something unseen has entered the room. I do not dress differently. I do not mark myself with sigils or color. My coat is plain, my boots soft-soled. I wear gloves most days, not to hide, but to preserve. The chamber is not clean in the way the city is clean. There is dust in the corners. There are echoes that linger longer than they should, and when I return from that place, I carry it, even if the cloth between us remains unstained. There is an alley near the southern wall where vendors sell things they do not list aloud. The butcher there sells meat that is not always what it claims to be. The glassman repairs bottles that were never broken. The woman in the corner paints charms no one believes in, but everyone buys. I pass through there often. They do not flinch when I enter. They do not look surprised. They know what I am, and they accept it, not out of respect, not out of fear, out of the simple understanding that the world requires certain roles, and some of those roles must be worn without apology. Once a man followed me, not closely, not threateningly, just enough that I noticed. His hat was too low, his shoes too loud. I turned a corner, stopped, and waited. When he appeared, I looked at him. Nothing more. He froze, then turned and walked away. I never saw him again, but I thought about him often, what he wanted, what he thought he might find. Perhaps he believed I carried secrets in my coat, or guilt in my steps. He was wrong. I carry only what the work allows. The city celebrates its soldiers, it honors its scholars, it rewards its merchants, but it does not speak of me. That is the way it must be. Justice is a clean word, a tall word, a word best left unsullied by the hands that deliver it, and I accept that. I do not seek parades. I do not seek absolution. I seek only the quiet nod that passes between those who understand that safety has a cost, and someone must keep the ledger balanced. The city does not thank me, but it continues, and in that I find enough. The court issues its commands with the cold efficiency of ink and seal, names, times, instructions, all written in a hand too careful to reveal emotion. But there are always things they do not ask, things they do not write, questions left unspoken, though their presence hangs like dust in the corners of each summons. What do they feel, these men who do not return? What is seen when the chamber closes its door? And most of all, what do I see? I have never been asked how it feels to wait, to prepare the room before the voice arrives, to fold the cloth, not with aggression, but with attention, to tie knots that will be untied, not because they failed, but because they succeeded. Waiting is its own kind of silence. It is not empty. It is a silence filled with the weight of what has not yet happened. And in that weight, there is shape. They do not ask how I listen, not just to the words, but to the space between them, the pace of breath, the way a sentence curls at the end when doubt creeps in, the sound of confidence when it slips and leaves only repetition. Truth is not a light that flicks on. It is smoke. You find it not by grabbing it, but by watching how it moves. I am not a judge. That is not my place. I am a listener, a reader of pressure, a translator of what the body says when the tongue falters. I do not decide who deserves to be here. I do not open the chamber for vengeance or pride. I open it because the wheel of process must turn, and I am one of its teeth. No one has ever asked if I sleep. I do, though not always easily. My dreams are not violent. They are not filled with screams or shadows. They are quiet, rooms without windows, staircases that never end, tables set for no one. It is not what I see that troubles me. It is what I do not see. I do not dream of the chamber, but I feel its presence in the stillness between moments, like a room waiting to be entered. They do not ask if I feel pity, as if pity were a poison, as if its presence would weaken the rope or dull the blade. But pity, when honest, is not weakness. It is recognition. I see their faces. I hear their words. I know that many of them are not monsters. They are frightened, angry, desperate. And still, I do what I must, because pity is not permission. It is awareness. I do not harden myself to it. I carry it quietly. I have never been asked what I think of justice, perhaps because they know the answer would not be useful. Justice is not a statue, not a sword. It is a process, flawed, slow, human. And like all processes, it depends on those who carry it forward. I am part of that machine, not the engine, not the wheels, but the weight that keeps it from spinning too fast. They do not ask what I would do if I were not here. Perhaps they fear the answer, or perhaps they know there is no other place I would fit as I do here. I have imagined other lives, a clerk, a stonemason, a teacher maybe, but none hold me in the same way. The chamber does not ask for who I could be. It accepts who I am. And that, perhaps, is what they fear to ask most of all. Not what I do, but why I remain. There are moments, rare and brief, when the chamber is so still that even my breath feels like an intrusion. Not because something has happened, but because nothing has. The tools remain untouched. The rope is clean, the bench holds only shadow. The lantern sways slightly, though there is no wind. I stand beside the door, gloved hands resting at my sides, and I listen not for footsteps, but for the absence of them. It is in these moments that the chamber feels most alive. The silence here is not passive. It watches. It records. Just as I do. The ledger rests on its stand, ink drying slowly across the last page. The names stretch backward, line by line, date by date. It is not the kind of book anyone reads for meaning. There are no stories in it, only facts, time, name, method, result. But I know the shape of every entry. I remember the hands that trembled, the eyes that held, the words that tried to lie, and those that did not. The ledger does not forget, and neither do I. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when the ledger ends, when the pages run out. when the space left for recording becomes narrower and narrower until the final line has no room? Will they bring another book? Will someone else take my chair, my gloves, my careful steps? Or will the chamber grow quiet forever, its doors closed, its bench covered, its ropes unwound for the last time? I do not fear that moment, but I think of it more often than I once did. I have never seen my own name in the ledger. That is not how the book works. But I have imagined it, written there in the same steady hand. No title, no note, just a name, followed by silence. I would not mind. It would mean that the book remained honest until the end. The world above changes. I hear it in the distance. More trials without pain, more confessions without force. They say people speak more freely now. That pressure is not always needed. That truth can be asked for, not taken. I do not deny this, but truth, in my experience, has never been so polite. It resists, it hides, and when it must be drawn out, someone must be the hand that draws. I am not proud of the chamber, but I am not ashamed either. It is a place of purpose, like the gallows, like the court, like the ledger. Each serves its part. Each keeps the machine moving, even if the parts are rusted or worn. There are tools I no longer touch, not because they are broken, but because the world has turned slightly, and their shape no longer fits its needs. I keep them wrapped, cleaned, remembered. They do not ask to be used. They rest, like old thoughts waiting for the right hour. The torch outside the chamber door flickers in the same rhythm it always has. I have watched it for years. Its flame grows weak, then strong, then weak again. It is a cycle without reason, but with rhythm, like the work, like the voice that echoes in the stone just before it breaks. I do not count the names anymore. I do not weigh them. Each one is part of the same pattern, the same long thread that began before me and will continue after. I do not seek to end it. I only follow it where it leads. Some nights, the wind outside carries voices, not screams, not whispers, just the sound of life moving past the stone. I listen. I close the ledger. I place the quill beside the ink, and I leave the chamber in silence, because silence, in the end, is the last tool I will ever use.